Messiah is coming. The Messiah has come. The Messiah has come for us all. But the prophet Micah today, and Joyce, thank you for reading, the prophet Micah says to us, "For out of you, O Bethlehem, out of the least of these, shall come the one who is to rule." Shall come the Messiah. The Messiah was to come from Bethlehem. Now Bethlehem was Podokville. Jerusalem was the capital. Jerusalem was the big city, was the metropolis where all the hospitals and the mall and all the, everybody wanted to go live. Jerusalem was the city. And Bethlehem was an old city. It was King David's city. Bethlehem meaning bread. But in these days, Bethlehem was nowhere. Have you ever been someplace that you really thought was nowhere? We used to live on the Laurelville Road in New Iberia. My dad left our house to go down to Franklin, Louisiana. He got turned around. He went to Laurelville, and without realizing it, the road turned him around and sent him back. He was going, "Oh, I've seen this already." Because Laurelville is the end of the road. You don't go anywhere but the Laurelville. There are lots of other places like that too. I grew up in Livingston Parish, and we were the redheaded stepchild to East Baton Rouge Parish, the big city. And if you lived out there, you were people and you fought over trucks and dogs and guns. Well, we did. But it was a good place to grow up. In fact, it was a place that everybody else thought was nowhere, that in my childhood was this idyllic, safe, wonderful place to grow up. There are places all over the world that seem to be nowhere. And the only people that could ever live there would be the people who are the least of these. And here we are in Bethlehem, Podokville. And the prophet says the Messiah is going to come out of that place. The Messiah is going to come out of that place. Well, you all know how Bethlehem plays in the story. Mary and Joseph are called forth to come to the census. Now Mary is out to hear pregnant. This is the last thing she wants to do, is travel. But she does, because that's what the law required. I heard today a little article about the census that is coming up, that we will all be counted by the government. And that it's important. How money's divvied up, how our tax dollars go, where it goes. We need a count so that we get our fair share, so to speak. But of course that share already came out of our pocket, but I'm not going there. But they have to go and be counted. Now on the census, in our census, they were talking about the reality that those of us with an address and a location and a job, we're pretty easy to count. What's awfully hard to count is that number of people who flow around us as so many people who move, people who don't have homes, people who are homeless in some way, people who are in jail. But there are all kinds of invisible layers of people, the least of these, that won't be counted, but need to be counted in this census. And I kind of think Mary and Joseph floated into that realm of people who were maybe not even worth counting. Because they get to Bethlehem, the city of bread, the city of David, the place where they're supposed to sign the book and say, "We really do exist, count us, we count for something." They get to the city, the little town, and there's a Holiday Inn, and there's no room in the inn. They get to the Comfort Inn, and there's no room in the inn. And I think maybe they ended up at the Studio 6, whatever it was, on the interstate. Last resort, the last one in town. And the innkeeper comes to the door and he says, "Man, I am just full up." But there's some piece of him that sees Mary and says, "I'll find room." And maybe in today's terms in some hotel, he gives them the laundry room. At least to be warm. But in some place, in some way, an innkeeper in old Bethlehem Do you realize that he reaches out to the least of these and he opens up his in some way? He opens up his possibility of his heart and he gives them a place. He gives the least of these a place. And the Messiah is born. I believe God was asking that little town of Bethlehem, let me do something wonderful with you. That's what the prophet Isaiah was prophesying to them. I'm going to do something wonderful with you. And it came down to one person responded to the least of these. And the prophecy was fulfilled. And God did do something wonderful with that little team. Now, Mary was in her own way the least of these. She was a teenager. We don't know how old she was, but somehow God chose her, the least of these. And God says to her, I'm going to fulfill all of this cosmic plan in this silly little teenager who probably in our time would have been wearing braces and chewing gum and texting. And God says to this typical teenager, I'm going to let you be a teenage pregnancy, an unwed mother, and I'm going to use you, the least of these, to do something wonderful. When the angel Gabriel comes to her and says, God has chosen you, God has favored you. Now there's a part of me that if I'd been Mary, I'd say, this doesn't sound much like favor to me. Because by embracing this role, she compromises her relationship with Joseph. She will be an outcast in the time where you just didn't do that. In fact, they ship her off to her cousin Elizabeth, so nobody sees. And here she is, the least of these, and somehow underneath the words of Gabriel, the angel, who proclaims to her this favor, she hears God say, help me do something wonderful. And she says, yes. Now, in Luke, and the ladies sang this, you sang the Magnificat. These are the words that are attributed to Mary as she responds to God's will and says, I'm in. I will. Be it done unto me, as your will is. And Mary proclaims what we call the Magnificat. She starts with, my soul magnifies the Lord. I'm in Luke 1, the 46th verse. Mary says, my soul magnifies the Lord. That's what you guys say. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. And she goes on to proclaim the greatness of God and her willingness to embrace her role. But then it becomes some of the most subversive language in the entire Bible. And she says, God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. God has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise that God has made to all those who come before us. And somehow Mary hears God say, do something wonderful with me. And God chooses the very least. And it brings salvation to the whole world because one person said, I will. And here's God's call. I have to tell you a personal story. Every year in the Methodist Church, every Methodist pastor and every SPR signs some paper